Yeah, thank you so much. I'm just very excited to be here. Receiving this award is a major honor, not just for me, but for the organization, which is now much more than me. We have over 200 full-time employees working for the NGO Khan Academy. We have thousands of people around the world who've volunteered for this effort, and so this award is really in recognition of all of their work. And it's also exciting because I hope it can bring recognition to the need for more efforts like this, and also help amplify our work, especially in Spanish, but really around the world. So it's a real honor to be here, and I'm eager to take questions.
Profesor Khan, cuando se les conceda el turno de palabra, indiquen por favor su nombre y el medio para el que trabajan. Comenzamos. Jaime.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Good
Soy Jaime
afternoon.
Martín de la
I'm Jaime Martín with Agencia F.
Con estos premios,
With these awards,
el Premio de Investigación Científica
the
y
one
Técnica
on
de este año ha
scientific and
recaído en dos
technical
biólogas
research, well, it's been
que
given
se
to two
dedican a
biologists
luchar contra el
working
cambio climático. Yo
against
querría saber
climate
si desde
change.
la
And I'd
educación
like to know
se
from the
puede
field of
contribuir
education, can
también
we
a poner
also
freno
contribute to try and
a ese
curb and
cambio
stop the climate
que una de las
change,
investigadoras decía que
which is a threat.
estamos
One
a punto
of the other
llegar al
laureates said
punto de
that
no
we are
retorno
about to reach
dentro de
that
10
tipping
años.
point, that would be within 10 years or so.
Yes, I hope so. You know, if you think about, there's really two levers for affecting climate change. One is a technological or research lever for climate change. The other is the political lever for climate change. And when you think about the technological and research lever, what I would love to help create is a world where far more people are able to engage in technology and research and engineering in order to solve the major problems of our world, especially climate change. And then on the political angle of it, the reason in my mind why many countries, including in the United States, where there hasn't been the political will to take action, it's because of a lack of education on the issue. And I would have to say maybe even I would go so far as a lack of critical thinking. And if people understood statistics, if they understood science better, more people would appreciate what, and even economics better, more people would appreciate the world that we are moving towards if we don't do something. You know, the thing that I'm always amazed by is when people make an economic argument against taking action. They say, hey, if we invest in renewable energy, et cetera, it might cost jobs someplace else. But that's a viewpoint where they're not informed by the economic consequences of climate change, of people being dislocated, more money needed to be spent in things like defense, in things that we'd prefer not to have to spend more resources in. So I think education is a lever on both sides. It can hopefully accelerate the amount of innovation we have to solve our problems, and in a world where even, well, for sure in democracies and even in non-democracies, the more that the population is able to understand what is happening, the more likely it'll drive change by the politicians.
Siguiente pregunta, por favor.
Next question.
Sí, aquí al fondo.
Back there.
Hola, soy Francisco Javier
García with Onda Cero radio station. The model that you created with the Khan Academy, is it the future of education? Is it the model that will help us reach all those places where it would not be possible to have schools built and so that everyone can have access to education?
I hope I think it'll be part of the future of education. I think for sure there's many students around the world who don't have access to schooling or who don't have access to good schooling, and that's where I think tools like Khan Academy can be very useful for them, and we have many examples of that happening. But I see the ideal is tools and resources like Khan Academy working in conjunction with your traditional classroom. Actually, there was just a Nobel Prize in economics awarded to two researchers at MIT who studied the effects of kids that are the most poor. And what they found is that these kids what really pulls them behind is they accumulate gaps in their learning as they move on. And in a traditional academic model, there's no way for them to address those gaps. And if you talk to any teacher, especially a teacher who serves kids whose families might not have as much resources, they will tell you that many of the kids enter the class already at a disadvantage. They're already a few years behind, but then the teacher has 30 kids in the classroom, and they feel pressure to keep teaching at a set pace to all of the kids. And so this is where I believe technology can help, where the technology can allow kids to work at their own time and pace, to fill in gaps as necessary, and then inform the teacher where the students are. If students already understand something, the teacher can move on. But if certain students need help, then the teacher can focus on those students. So I see the future of education being a world in which students are able to learn and master concepts at their own time and pace, a world where teachers are informed by data and information in almost real time, and in a world where education and learning doesn't stop when you are 18 years old or doesn't stop when you're 22 years old, that it goes on throughout your life. Because the other thing we know about the future, whether it's because of technological change or even things like climate change, the world is only changing faster and faster and faster. And we all need to learn faster and faster and faster, and learning resources have to be available your entire life.
Siguiente pregunta, por favor.
Next question.
Sí, aquí adelante, por favor. Carmen.
Carmen, in the front.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon.
Carmen Casal,
Medicina Asturiana. First, congratulations on the award. I'd like to know something a bit personal, I have to say. It was a great idea, but initially it seemed normal, right? But where's the key to your success? This is a great idea, but where lies the key to the success? And what does it feel when something very normal ends up reaching out so many people and being a breakthrough in education?
Thank you for that. I think, it's funny. You're right that if I saw myself 10 years ago and what Khan Academy does, I would have been very happy. But when I'm now sitting in this chair, I'm only always thinking about what we need to do for the next 10 years, because still there's so much to do. In terms of my sense of why we have gotten where we've gotten, I think it's in the early days, it was good that this started off as a project for my family. People could sense that it was authentic, that it was not coming from a big corporation or a big government entity. Sometimes when those entities, they might have good intent, but it feels very impersonal. And I think in learning, and especially in things like math and science, many students feel very stressed about the learning process. And so to hear something that felt calming, to hear something that felt intuitive, that felt caring, that there's even love love and mathematics, most people don't put together usually. But as human beings, we all connect to that type of a feeling. So I think that helped. I think it helped that, I was fortunate as I grew up that I had a lot of passion for learning. And for me, it was always very important for me to make connections between different things. And I was always disappointed in school when I saw that things were taught disconnected. And so when I was teaching my cousins, I tried to give them that understanding, that what they're learning in math connects to what they're learning in history, connects to what they're learning in science. And it might just be a little bit of a comment, but it starts opening up your world. You start looking at the world a little bit differently. And it seems like a lot of students were attracted to that. I think another dimension is, this maybe comes from me reading too many science fiction books. In the early days of Khan Academy, it could have been just a YouTube channel, or it could have been just a kind of a software company. But I've always dreamt that why couldn't this be a bigger institution for the world? That, over the last 500 and 1,000 years, we've had things like universities and museums and libraries. And the thought was, well, maybe Khan Academy could be an institution for this next many generations. And it can reach millions, maybe billions of people over time. And so I think one element is also, so I think there's the authenticity, the caring, the intuitiveness, but there's also to make sure that the vision is big. And I think what I found is many people have been drawn to that vision. It's one thing, you can just have a big vision, but if you aren't doing anything about it, people think you're just a theoretician. And then there's a lot of people who do stuff, but the vision is small. I think if you have a big vision, but if you show that you can make progress towards the big vision, most people in the world, I think, want to get behind something like that.
Muchas gracias. Siguiente pregunta, por favor.
Thank you very much. Next question.
Jaime.
Jaime.
Sí, hola de nuevo.
Hello again. I'd like to know, has education failed, or is it a result of education that we see there is a progression in nationalisms, populisms, and those extreme disciplines all over the world, or thoughts all over the world?
Yeah. No, I like to think about things over long periods of time, and when you think about it long periods of time, education has definitely not failed. If anything, its public education has been very successful when you think about it over the last 200-300 years. If you were to go back 500 years to Oviedo, 500 years ago, you would have seen about 20% of the population would have known how to read. And I suspect that if you ask someone who knew how to read, say a priest, a member of the clergy, what percentage of the population do you think is even capable of reading? They might have said maybe 30 or 40% if you have a great education system. But around 200 years ago, you start having free mass public education, which would have seemed utopian to that medieval priest in Oviedo 500 years ago. And now we see, because of mass education, that what only 20% of people could do 500 years ago, now almost 100% of the population can read. 100% of the population at least has basic mathematics. Some of the trends that you're talking about around populism and nationalism, I think these are some of the cracks that are forming because of the change of where we are in society. So our traditional education system served us reasonably well during the industrial age, during the Industrial Revolution, because in the industrial labor model and even the political model, you had a labor pyramid. You had a need for a lot of labor for people to work in factories. You also needed a lot of people in the information processing class. And then you needed very few people in the industrial age who were the knowledge workers, who were journalists, who were lawyers, doctors, engineers, teachers, researchers, entrepreneurs. But what you've been seeing over the last 20 or 30 years is, as technology has accelerated, it's made capital have much more power than labor. And the extreme is, in the next 20, 30 years, we'll see things like automation, artificial intelligence and automation even more decrease the need for labor. And then it'll increase the value for the knowledge work. And so as a society, we have to make a decision. Are we just going to let all of that productivity accrue to the top, in which case all of the people in the bottom are left behind and you'll probably have a destable society? Or do we try to get as many people into the top as possible? And so I think these trends of nationalism and populism are because in the last 20 or 30 years, you have seen inequality increase at the same time that you've had things like globalization and technology accelerate. And unfortunately, it's oftentimes human nature to correlate the globalism with the inequality, when it's really probably more about the technology. But no one's going to stop technology. And so I think it's, no one's going to stop the trend, or it's very difficult to stop the trend of technology, especially because it could, in theory, be used for good. So my view is, I'm not a political scientist, but I do think we will probably see some trends get maybe even worse in the near term. But in the medium and long term, this makes it that much more important that we can get more people to educate themselves out of their situation. I think in the next 10, 15 years, there will be things like self-driving cars, self-driving trucks. And truck driving and driving cars, driving cabs. This is actually the largest employer of 18 to 55-year-old men in places like the United States and Europe. And if they get displaced from work because of technology and they don't have another better option, nationalism and populism is going to get far worse than it is today. It'll become very unstable. And so this is why it's so important that we can, I would say, supercharge education so that these people have a chance of participating in what promises to be a very a positive future if everyone can participate.
Sí, siguiente pregunta.
Next question.
Hola, soy Patricia de Televisión
Patricia
Española,
with the Spanish television channel. I'd like to know, in a country such as Spain, where we see that the educational system is closely linked to politics and policy making or the government in power at the time, I'd like to know, how do you understand that whenever there's a change in the political party that is ruling, there's a change in the educational system as well and the educational laws? What do you think about that?
Yes, I mean, what you're describing, we've seen in many countries. We see it in the United States as well. And I think there's two layers here. It is true. Every time there's a change in the leader of a district or a Ministry of Education, they want to change the standards, they want to change the assessment. And this is a global phenomenon. You know, the research actually shows that things like changing just the standards and that actually has very little impact on students. So it's really just, in some ways, it's always good to have better standards. It's always good to have better assessment. It's always good to have better textbooks and curriculum. But when you look at the evidence, what looks like the main issue is that many of the kids, as they move through the system, are accumulating gaps. And those gaps become very difficult for them to repair. And so at some point, especially kids with high needs, they end up struggling later on in life. And so what we aim to do is, first of all, we are very non-political. In the United States, it's interesting. In the United States, I've spoken to both the House Democrats, so all of the Democratic Party, and I've also spoken to all the House Republicans. And I took a lot of satisfaction that on both sides, they said that what we're doing represents their party. It represents, the Republican says it represents conservative values because it's about people being able to improve themselves and find opportunity. And then the Democrats on the left in the United States said this is about their beliefs because this is about ensuring that there's an equality of opportunity. And so my hope, and I think we've done this reasonably well, is that regardless of party, people see that this is a free tool, it's a non-commercial tool, we're there to support teachers, we're there to support parents, we're there to support students, that this could be kind of non-political and slowly make progress. I don't think it's going to happen overnight, but we are seeing that where we can focus, that people on both sides of these political debates tend to get behind this, because at the end of the day, I do think, even though politics can sometimes get messy and sometimes nasty, I do think that most people at the end do actually want to do what's right, and especially they want to do what's right for children. So, maybe I have an overly naive or optimistic belief, but I think that's the best that we can do is hope that that's where people are.
Good afternoon. Elena Fernández Pello with La Nueva España. I'd like to know, people talk about separating or splitting the humanities and the science or technology, so science and the humanities separately. How do you feel about that? Do you think that society can move forward if we keep on splitting both faces to the same kind of knowledge?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think it would be nicer to be able to integrate those more, because they are so heavily related. You can't understand world history if you don't understand the development of technology. Technology inflection points have always been, in history books, they just say this revolution happened or this group conquered this group. And it seems like it happens randomly. But most of the time, it's due to something that happened in the environment, something that happened in technology, something that happened in science. And so to separate these two things, I completely agree, and oftentimes very connected to economics. And so it is unfortunate that sometimes these things are separated. What I find even more unfortunate is many times people think that some people are good at math and science and some people are good at humanities and writing. And they tend to not think that, no, we should all be very good at both in order to be productive and happy and contributing members of society. What we try to do at Khan Academy, we try to make our resources useful to the world as it is today. So in the world as it is today, kids in high school and in college, they are learning math separate from science, and that's separate from humanities. But the more that as we approach these subjects, we can give a little bit of connection between, I think that would be great. Over the next 5-10 years, I hope that we can also help catalyze ways for these things to be more melded, because I agree. I think it's very important. One thing that I think is a side effect of, I teach a lot of the material on Khan Academy, including the math or science, and in many cases even history, is that I think it sends a signal to many students to say, oh, you don't have to be a math person or a humanities person. You should just be a curious person. And if you're a curious person, the world all of a sudden becomes much more interesting, and it also starts to make a lot more sense.
I have one question again, Patricia Alvarez, Spanish television. What about sex separation? What I mean is segregation. So in school, they have different classrooms for boys and girls. Can it have an impact? Can it have an impact on education, and how?
I'm not an expert on what is better, whether it's better to, in some cases, separate gender, in some cases have mixed classrooms. I've heard arguments on either side. With that said, one of the things that we want to do is, I've been told by a mother of an African-American daughter in the U.S. that what they love about Khan Academy is there's no bias in the content. The content assumes that you can learn this material. And what happens too many times in classrooms is sometimes there might be a bias in the mind of the instructor. They might see certain students as, oh, those are the smart kids. And they might see other students saying, oh, those kids, they don't have to learn as much. Or they might have a bias for boys against girls, or a bias for girls and against boys. You never know. And everyone has some types of bias. And so one of the values that we want to bring is that it should have as little bias as possible, so that any student's experience should be the same. And we're able to measure some of this. We're able to run studies to say when certain groups, whether it's race, ethnicity, gender, income level, when they spend a certain amount of time on our platform, is the impact the same for all of the students, or is it different for certain groups or others? And if it is different, how can we change the platform or customize the platform so that we can meet everyone's needs? And we're still at a very early stage of doing that, but this is at least, I think, a positive step, because historically you haven't been able to do this type of research. For example, the people who write textbooks, they really don't know which part of the textbook is engaging, which part is not engaging, which part of the textbook is efficacious, which part is not, whether certain parts of the textbooks are good for boys and other parts are good for girls, certain races, income groups, you don't know. But with online, we can start to measure all of these things. And obviously another aspect, and I think you're talking more about mixed gender and or not, but obviously in many parts of the world, more conservative parts of the world, women aren't able to get access to education either at all or at a very different level. And that's where I think we can also be very helpful. There's an example, I'll talk about it in my speech on Friday, about a young girl in Afghanistan she was in a town that the Taliban said, girls can't go to school. And they even threatened her with physical violence. And then she was able to find our resources, and then that's what allowed her to learn. And eventually she decided that she wanted to come to the U.S. and become a physicist. That type of thing wouldn't have been possible even 10 years ago. So that is part of it. I hope we can make a dent on whatever disparities there are in gender.